And students, be aware that this thing likes to travel.
There we go. Should be better now. Should be better now. Okay.
And I want to draw your attention to two issue briefs in your packet. One is called New York Property Tax Cap Impact Analysis. It's 4 pages. And the other one is called Tax Caps in Other States, Lessons for New York, and it's 6 pages. If you're missing the one on the impact analysis, some of the folders didn't get it, and there's extra copies out at the main desk, but it provides the methodology and the data behind what the students are going to present really quick in 15 minutes. So if you want more information, here it is. And I also wanted to remind you that all of the PowerPoints and all of the issue briefs are on the website. And so if they're not up there yet, they'll be up there by the end of the conference. So right now I'd like to turn it over to Robert Riviera and Yuan Shoshu to present on the tax cap impact analysis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out today and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hear our research and our analysis of New York State's property tax cap. My name is Robert Rivera, and this is Yun Xiaoxu. And today we'll be presenting the various impacts New York State's property tax cap has on local municipalities. We recognize that the implications are broad, especially for schools and local government. However, our research is focused predominantly on local government, specifically cities, counties, towns, and villages in New York State. So I'm sure you're all familiar with New York State's property tax cap. It was passed in 2011 and implemented in 2012 and was designed to control the future growth of property taxes in local government, excluding New York City, by limiting the tax levy growth to the lesser of 2% or inflation. It's still fairly new, so the long-term implications have yet to be realized. However, there's much concern over the stringent nature of the policy. First, the policy is complex, as you can see. It does not allow for simple majority overrides. Schools, in order to override, must have a supermajority of voters, and local municipalities must have a supermajority of elected officials. Second, the exemptions included in the policy are limited, with no exemptions for disaster relief, capital overlays, and debt payment. Lastly, the policy is implemented equally across all municipalities and disregards the differences in wealth and population densities. In addition, the law was passed without significant changes to state aid or mandate relief. So our goal throughout the entire process was to best estimate the impact of New York property tax cap now and in the future. And to do so, we approached the topic from multiple angles, applying both a quantitative and qualitative approach. First, we applied a cross-state comparison of tax and expenditure limitations. Then we studied the revenue structure of cities, counties, towns, and villages in New York State. And then after, we analyzed the recent impacts on expenditure since the adoption of the policy, focusing on critical services. Then we applied our model. Our model hypothetically adopts the tax cap in the year 2000, 10 years prior to its actual adoption date, in order to best estimate the long-term effect of the policy, supplemented by in-depth case studies for specific states to learn lessons for the future. So if you are interested, please take a look at our issue briefs. They go into more detail, and the study has been compared across the 30 years since the first adoption of a tax expenditure limitation. In general, we found that the tax caps have little impact on local government size and increases the dependence on state aid and user fees. Fiscal stress may also increase, and in response, local governments are forced to reduce public services. We also found that regional inequality tends to increase as wealthier localities are better able to raise funds independently. Overall, we found that tax caps have the potential to harm economic growth statewide. So now Yuncha will speak about our model and our analysis.
So in our tax cap impact analysis, we first look at the short-term impacts. We examine what happened to local government expenditure on the cap year from year 11 to 13. In order to compare across time, we deflate the expenditure data by GDP. So in this chart, you can see in cities, the largest expenditure component is public safety. It's cut by 4% of $48 million. How we can ensure our safety issues in cities under these cuts, and also cities cut their transportation spending by 8% of $33 million. The increased spending of cities are in general governments and employee benefits. This chart displays the expenditure of counties. So social services, as the largest spending component in counties, is cut by 4% and around $200 million. And health spending dropped dramatically. You can tell by the chart, by 14% and $264 million. So we find broader and steeper range of cuts to services in counties because counties have the largest mandates. Transportation is very important expenditure component for towns and is also the key elements to local economies. But you can see it's cut by 3% of $41 million in towns. And towns also cut their second largest piece of sanitation by 6% of $51 million. So how can we maintain our water and sewer system under these cuts? And this broad cuts is also found in the villages. The largest spending component for villages is public safety, and it's cut by almost 4% of $20 million. So in general, we find tax cap induces general cuts to services for local governments. And these cuts are majorly in some critical service areas, such as public safety and transportation. So these cuts may be too much for local governments to maintain the basic service to meet citizen needs. And we also find employee benefits are increasing under tax cap. And this cost of employee benefits are outside of local government control, such as pension, which is determined by New York State Controller Office, or health insurance, which is affected by the stock market. This increasing cost of employee benefits will further crowd out local budgets on other expenditures. So this highlights the importance of the state aid and the mandate relief. We are also interested in the long-term impacts of tax cap. So before we conducted any projection of this long-term tax impacts, we did a preliminary study to decompose local government revenue structure. We want to know how dependent of local governments are on property tax for their revenues. The blue line here represents the real property tax percentage in total revenues for different types of local government. We found cities and counties are less dependent on property tax revenues for their revenues. Cities has property tax less than 25%, and it has evenly distributed revenue sources. And counties have property tax revenues around 20%, and the counties have sales tax as their most important revenue sources. To the contrary, we find towns are highly dependent on property tax. You can see the blue line sitting at the top of the chart and above all other sources. So property tax revenues account for around 50% for towns' revenues, and towns have limited other sources for their revenues. Villages are also dependent on the property tax revenues, but villages have substantial user fees as its alternative sources. So due to this dependence on property tax, we expect towns and villages will be hurt the most on the tax cap policy. Then we conducted our what-if model to quantify this long-term tax cap impact. Instead of making too many assumptions for the future, we look back and study what the tax revenue loss would be if the New York tax cap was implemented 10 years ago. There are two important elements for our projection. First is the growth factor. Multiplied by the previous tax levy will determine the allowable tax base. And the other important element is tax cap, which is the inflation rate measured by the CPI index or 2% cap, whichever is less, to determine the tax levy increase rate. And our models covers all the local governments in New York State, excluding New York City. Our data sources include local government finance data from New York State Controller Office, and tax cap year data from 12 to 13, and CPI index from BLS. So our model results could be interpreted through the comparison between the observed property tax levy and the projected tax levy. In this chart, the black line represents the observed tax levy, with the average annual increase levy rate 4.2%. And the red line represents our model results, the projected tax levy, with average annual increase rate 2.2% on the tax cap. And we found there are in total 30% property tax revenue loss, which is illustrated by the shadow. You may notice the increased cumulative effects of these long-term tax impacts. As we only have our tax cap implemented for about 3 years, we can assume we are sitting at the year 04. So if the tax cap was continued to be implemented for a long time, we may move to the right end of the chart, and this tax revenue loss would be compounded and would be higher and higher. And this long-term tax cap impacts was also differentiated by different types of local governments in our model. Here are two summary tables of our model results. First shows the average first shows the tax revenue loss annually, and the other shows the tax revenue loss in 10-year total. Through the comparison between the column observed tax revenue increase and the second column projected tax revenue increase, we will find the tax revenue shortfall in both percentage and real items. Let's look at the numbers highlighted in red. Like what you just saw in previous slides, the average annual increase 4.2% would have dropped to 2.2% on the tax cap. And the total tax revenue loss would be 30% and over $13 billion for the 10-year total. And consistent with our preliminary study, we found towns and villages are hurt the most on the tax cap with around 34% and 42% tax revenue shortfall. We also find this geographic variation of this tax cap impacts. Not all the local governments will be affected by the tax cap. We found 231 localities were not affected by the tax cap. To be specific, 9 cities and 2 counties, 147 towns and 73 villages, they already have the lower property tax. So, and they are majorly in upstate New York. There are places historically constrained by the low wealth and limited tax base. In this point, tax cap, what they need might not be tax cap, maybe the mandate relief to reduce their fiscal burdens. So to sum up, our findings include we find property tax revenue would have dropped 30% over time, over 10 years on the cap. And tax loss is too drastic to maintain basic service for local governments. And towns and villages are the places will be hurt most on the tax cap. And what we can learn from other states' experience, I will turn this to Rob.
So if you do look at the other issue brief, we highlight 6 different cities, and if you're interested in the topic, please take a look. But today we'll profile California and Massachusetts. So California was one of the first states to implement a property tax cap in 1978 with Proposition 13. Proposition 13 differs from New York in that it limits the annual growth of assessed value to 2% or inflation and fixes the property tax cap to 1% of assessed value, and then property is reassessed when sold. Although on paper, Proposition 13 seems more strict than New York's property tax cap, the effect of the law has been diminished over time as communities faced financial hardship. More exceptions were added by the state legislature and the public through referendum. And for example, in 1982, the state created a new type of local improvement district that was exempt from Proposition 13. Although it required local voter approval, these districts proliferated throughout the state since their inception. However, the immediate impacts of Proposition 13 was substantial. In the first fiscal year after its implementation, county property tax revenue fell from $10.3 billion to $5 billion, a loss of almost 51%. Because of a large surplus budget and a strong economy, the state government implemented a $4.85 billion relief plan, which included a one-time bailout. They doubled categorical aid to schools and relieved counties of some responsibilities for certain health and welfare costs. Massachusetts Proposition 2.5 was implemented in 1980 and served as the inspiration of the New York property tax cap. It limits the annual growth of the tax levy to 2.5% plus physical growth and implements a maximum levy ceiling of 2.5% of total assessed value. Proposition 2.5 is more lenient in that voters can approve the increases above the limit with a simple majority vote, and the levy ceiling can be exceeded if the increase is for temporary infrastructure debt. Proposition 2.5 was also adopted at an opportune time when Massachusetts was experiencing rapid economic growth, and K-12 enrollment was also dropping, which meant that schools could afford to operate under a smaller budget. The proposition itself does not require the state to offset local tax losses, but after much heated debate with local government, the legislature increased state aid by $265 million in the first fiscal year. Since the passage of Proposition 2.5, override votes have been on the rise. Voter survey suggests that by 1990, most people either regretted the severity of the tax policy or felt that its mission had been accomplished. And empirical research shows that communities with higher per capita income had higher rates of override approvals, as well as a higher total dollar amount in these approved overrides. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn? Unfortunately, there's still enough time to make changes. In order to lower tax burden for municipalities, the state needs to enact more mandate relief, and more state aid is necessary. A simple majority override should be allowed, as well as more exceptions for disaster relief, capital overlays, and debt payments. And in conclusion, a 30% tax revenue cut is too deep to maintain and provide critical services that citizens expect. If left unaddressed, the tax cap could seriously undermine the resiliency and long-term sustainability of New York.
Thank you, Yansho and Robert and the team, Hector and Christine. Wave your hands. They're all sitting down there together for organizing this. I thought it was interesting, the idea of going back 10 years to sort of go back to look to see what the future might look like. But now what we want to do is turn to our panel of experts for some comments on these issues. And I'd like to start with Marion Bott from the League of Women Voters. And you'll each get 5 minutes, and then we'll have some crosstalk with each other. So you can actually come up here, or you can sit at your seat, because you've all been wired with microphones.
I'm pretty sure they equipped us. We are, am I being amplified, so to speak? Great. Thank you very much, Mildred and Ron, for including the League of Women Voters in this panel. I have to say that I am delighted that my fellow panelists are sitting here with me because they work on these issues full-time, not Frank, not now, but Frank certainly put in enough years full-time to count for all of us, I think. We, as League of Women Voters members, are volunteers, and I have 3 colleagues in the audience with me, our Executive Director, Laura Bierman, wherever she is, Victoria, Malilo Jordan, our new policy associate, and our legislative director, Barbara Bartoletti. We work on coalition building to support our points of view on various issues, and the property tax cap issue is one of those issues that we would love to be able to say, we lobbied well, we did a great job, and we kept it from being implemented. But the reality is, I have some handouts in the back. Here's a letter, August 18th, 2008, to Governor Patterson and Dean Eskelos and Sheldon Silver, providing our criticisms, very well thought out, et cetera. You can read the whole thing, why this was not going to work. So every single thing that we said was going to happen, that the students have so well illustrated, has happened. It was badly conceived, it was badly implemented, a percentage cap that disfavors the communities with the least ability to raise property taxes, wasn't going to work. Furthermore, we were at that time in the I'd say, 8th year of our strong support for the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit. And we held that there was no reason to, on one hand, put in a property tax cap, but on the other hand, not implement foundation aid. So it became very tempting for the public to buy into the notion that the property tax cap came first, and then of course foundation aid would come later. And that was 2008, and we know what happened with the economy since then. Now, here's 2011. This is a Ron Deutsch press release. Groups urge state leaders to support real property tax relief. Circuit breaker, caution that 2% hard tax cap will hurt services in New York State. Now is the time to broaden the discussion. So again, this is a handout. There are probably 14 organizations on this list, including the Fiscal Policy Institute, NICET, others who are here in the room. So can we say that we did a good job? Where did we go wrong? Why were we such a miserable failure in terms of implementing our position? Here we are again, Monday, March 24th, 2014, and this is our most recent issue that we are in coalition with others on. This is Assembly and Governor must stand firm against education investment tax credit. Groups unite to urge public dollars for public education. So we're not here necessarily today to talk about the tuition tax credit, but trust me, you will see a lot of League of Women Voters action on this issue. I am here to say that we are a grassroots organization. We are willing to implement what we call action alerts. And if and when something's happening, moving on a bill, we can leverage other groups' times, and this is what we want to do on the property tax cap. You know, it's up for renewal in 2015. I don't know exactly when. Does anybody know whether it's the end of the year or anyone here? No one knows when? End of June. Okay, so this is not a lobbying issue for this year necessarily, but we have to build the momentum.
June 15th.
June 15th.
June 2015.
June 25th.
The end of June 2015, rent control.
So then it is.
Correct. Yes.
So then it is. Okay, so we'll be doing that too. All right, I'm going to yield to my fellow panelists.
Great, thank you very much, Marion. You came in under time, I appreciate that. Moving on, Deborah Cunningham from the New York State Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you. I'm Director of Education and Research for the New York State Association of School Business Officials, and before that, I have 3 decades of experience in research, policy, and practice at the New York State Education Department, and I was elected president of the Association of Education, Finance, and Policy. So I'm going to talk about implications of the tax cap on school districts. And I want to say, by just starting out, that the New York State Association of School Business Officials its primary focus is the use of data and information to support creative state and local responses to help solve educational problems. So this, the theme, the tone of this meeting is right up our alley. And to that end, we have published 9 reports over the last year on different phases of the school finance year, the needs, a description of state aid to school districts, executive and legislative responses, tax and spending plans of school districts, budget votes and the tax cap and overrides, and school district spending, and a report on mergers. So that's all on our website at www.nysasbo.org. So I wanted you to know that there is a lot of information there and refer you there. And then the third thing, just by way of introduction, is that on September 30th, we spent a day discussing this topic. We hosted a school finance symposium. It was called Balancing Educational Excellence with Tax Relief. And we assumed in that conference that the state had the right to pursue educational improvement and tax relief and could pursue both policy goals simultaneously, but how could we best do so? So some of what I'm going to tell you is from that. So what I'd like to just tell you briefly is what we know from all this information and what we can do about it. First, there are numerous New York State ASBO and other reports that show that the education revenue picture has been adverse for school districts over the past 6 years. There's no question about that. Educationally, much has changed. Learning standards have changed, assessments, teacher evaluation, and data privacy requirements. During this time, New York State school districts lost 10% of their workforce. The combination of these revenue challenges and education reforms has been chaotic at best. Each education dollar is currently made up of approximately 40 cents from the state, 55 cents from local revenues, and 5 cents from the federal. That's a little bit different from data that Mildred pointed out earlier, but that was included higher education. So just to clarify that. Funding shifts to local revenues have added to the stress. Over the past decade, the local share, mostly property taxes, of school district revenue has grown 5%, while the state share has declined 4% and the federal aid has declined 2%. While local revenues have been contained by the tax cap, state school aid has been reduced or frozen, such that more than half of school districts have less school aid in 2014 than they did in 2008. The combined effect of the tax cap and the state aid cap, we actually did an analysis similar to the Cornell students, but we projected going forward, comparing historical growth and projected revenues under these two tax cap, and we found a $17 billion gap over about a 6-year period. And what we're seeing is the growth in school spending over about 15 years was 5.6%. And then over the last 4 years, it's gone to 2.1%. So a huge change for school districts. The next point is that the 40 cents from state sources includes about 6 cents for school tax relief. School aid and aid for tax relief have competing purposes. Aid for tax relief does little to help schools provide equal educational opportunity. So often we look at the state share, oh, it's 40%, but it really isn't, because the aids are going for very different purposes. And then finally, many cost areas have factors outside the control of school districts and are increasing at much greater rates than average school costs. For example, pension costs increased about 300% over the last 10 years. And costs for debt service principal also increased about 135%, while total school spending increased only 47%. So, and I think we can also say a lot has been talked about the diversity in New York State, and that is also reflected in New York State school districts. Creative local responses. There are some really creative local responses, and let's look close nearby. The Saratoga City School District has a management system where they combine the board, the finance office, and the instructional leadership of the district. And they have a structure to align what they're doing in finance and in program every month with the district's mission. A very exciting example of creative local response. Also, Forecast 5 is a data analytics tool that we're starting to use in New York State, and it's helping examine finance and student results to find cost-effective solutions for better education. Let's see. Recommendations. What can we do about this? The first, really most important thing is state aid to school districts. We really need to increase state school aid in accordance with sound education proposals while we're going to be limiting our local revenues. So this means like eliminating the gap elimination adjustment reductions on school districts expeditiously, fully funding foundation aid, using a portion of settlement funds for one-time school district costs, such as already approved prior year aid adjustments and growth aid for to help school districts educate the surge in unaccompanied minors. And not resetting the building aid interest rate until the gap elimination adjustment is restored and foundation aid is fully funded. That's a $23 million hit on school districts, which will make it even worse. Also, we suggest making technical amendments to adjust the tax cap to support both education and tax relief. So we're not saying get rid of it, we're saying let's just make some adjustments. If we did want to get rid of it, we would go with the circuit breaker, but we're kind of in the reality of it's here to stay. So what we are suggesting is allowing school districts to carry over unused amounts under the maximum allowable levy limit like New Jersey. Counting local assessments for properties that are exempt due to a payment in lieu of taxes when calculating the tax-based growth that is allowable. And allowing the exclusion from the tax cap of local expenditures for capital projects for instructional spaces provided by BOCES. These are small little adjustments that would help ease some of the pressures and better support school districts, but the real answer will be in the state school aid. And of course, in addition, we need to continue to foster and encourage the local collaborations for these creative responses like Saratoga's management system and the Forecast 5 data analytics tool. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. Now I'd like to turn to Frank Morrow, keeping in line with the program, though not necessarily the order in which we're sitting at the table. Frank?
Thank you very much. The issue for school districts, is, I think, has been framed well by Deborah, that the focus needs to be on additional school aid, I think for two important reasons. The ability to pay for schools' property tax value per pupil isn't by some magic divided among school districts in the same proportion as their pupils, but also by greater reliance on state aid results in greater reliance on a fairer tax base. While economists will point out that the property tax is not as regressive as the sales tax, it's still regressive, and people like it less than they like the sales tax. So there's tremendous hostility to the property tax, and there should be, and we should be paying for more of our services out of progressive taxes. But I think the way to do that is not to establish income taxes at the local level, but to pay for more of needed services at the state level through a formula that equalizes need and ability to pay. I think while that's well understood on the school aid front, the equivalent of school aid for counties, towns, villages, and cities is revenue sharing. And revenue sharing is a lot smaller than school aid, and it's taken more of a hit over the decades than school aid. I think we need to really increase both school aid and revenue sharing, because the calculus for general purpose local governments is very similar to the calculus that Deborah pointed out for school districts. So I think we really need to move more to a progressive tax base, and the way to do that is by having the state pay for a greater share and to provide aid in a fair and equitable manner. The foundation formula has two key steps which think about this logically. First is a foundation amount calculated on number of pupils, pupil needs measured by poverty and English language learners. So the first step in the foundation formula is saying, what's the foundation amount? What's the amount of money each school district needs to provide a sound basic education? And the second step is that foundation amount should be divided in a logical way between state and local government, as a way not to put too much pressure on the local tax base. But we've created a mess, because we have all these conflicting programs. We have the foundation formula, which is logical, STAR, which, as Marion and Deborah both pointed out, distributes money to school districts in a way that cancels out some of the equalizing effect of school aid. We've now made it more complicated by creating a second state funding mechanism. In addition to STAR, is the property tax freeze credit. There's now a check in the mail for the difference between what your property taxes were last year and what they are under the cap if your local government or school district lives with it. I think we have too much of a mess. And I think that all of this has to be integrated, and the STAR is wacky enough, but the cap adds another wacky element, and then the cap reimbursement credit is just really crazy, because what it's doing is it's taking money that could be used to adequately fund school aid and using it for checks in the mail for a portion of the property taxes. So I think it's even worse than STAR, and STAR is pretty bad. Now, all of this doesn't mean that I don't think we should fix the cap a little bit, and so I agree with Deborah. And I point to Massachusetts because Massachusetts has a effective functioning education system. And so one of the arguments for the cap was, well, Massachusetts could live with a cap without destroying education. Why can't New York? And there are 4 points I would make. So, one of which has been emphasized by the student paper, which is a 60% vote to override the cap rather than a 50% vote. Second, is the fact that the question that has to be on the ballot in New York is confrontational. It makes it sound stupid to override the cap. It reads, this is the language that has to be used. Adoption of this budget requires a tax levy increase of blank, which exceeds the statutory tax increase limit of blank for this school year, and therefore exceeds the state tax cap and must be approved by 60% of the qualified voters present in voting. The Massachusetts wording is, shall the city or town of blank be allowed to assess an additional blank dollars in real estate and personal property taxes for the purpose of blank, such as increased library services for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, blank. So it's a totally different kind of question. Third, Massachusetts allows multiple override questions on the ballot at the same time for different purposes, and allows a, in effect, competitive resolution. Shall we add $100,000 for library services? Shall we add $200,000 for library services? And the highest amount that gets a majority vote prevails. And the final difference with the Massachusetts cap, which is similar to what Deborah said, I haven't studied New Jersey, but it's similar to what Deborah says New Jersey has, which is the cap, whether you use it or not each year, grows. And in Massachusetts, the cap grows each year. So it's a levy limit that grows, because the mechanism we have is going to really prove to be problematical if we ever go back into a period of high inflation, because the amount is based on the percentage of a year earlier in inflation, but it's 2% of the rate of inflation, whichever is less. And so you can have, if you have a period of inflation going up and down, you can have with the New York cap, very tumultuous changes in budgeting from year to year, whereas if the limit just grew, I think it would be a more sensible thing. So I think there are 4 things about Massachusetts we should think about, but while we're thinking about that, we can't forget that fixing the cap while it's lessening the pain is less important than providing adequate state aid and providing it in a fair manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Finally, I'd like to give the last word to Peter Appleby from the New York State Teachers.
Thanks. Before I talk a bit about the points that everyone's raised here, I should just say that it hasn't been mentioned so far today, I don't think, is that NYSET is suing on the tax cap, claiming that it's unconstitutional. We were not successful to trial court level, but we'll persevere and move forward. And some of the points that Frank raised actually as part of the lawsuit, our essential argument is that it unconstitutionally restricts the ability of a community to raise revenues to comply with the constitutional requirement that we have in Article 11, Section 1 of our state constitution. Wealthier districts spend more per pupil than poorer districts on average. That's not news. But if you constrain people to a similar % increase, the district that spends more will be allowed to spend even greater amounts as time goes on. So a wealthy district that spends $40,000 per pupil may be able to raise $700, $800 a pupil per year, whereas a poor district spending half or less than that will be able to raise, $100 or $200 per pupil on their local tax levy. And that combined with the state aid cuts that occurred along with a 60% supermajority requirement that we believe is also unconstitutional, kind of forms the basis of our suit. One thing we haven't talked about is impact on students. We've talked about it indirectly. We did an analysis that looked at performance on the new Common Core aligned grades 3 through 8 math and ELA exams that were first administered in the spring of 2013. And we sorted the districts by what's called the combined wealth ratio, which is the standard wealth measurement used for state aid purposes for schools. And it's a composite of income per child, wealth in a community, and property value per child in the community. And we organize those by deciles. And it's pretty much a straight line. The poorest decile of school districts have the lowest percent of children who are proficient on those new state exams, about 20% or so. And each decile you get wealthier, the percentage of students that are proficient gets higher. And eventually at the 10th decile, you have about half the students being proficient on the new exams. And so that has an impact on students here too. If we're unable to close the spending gap, we're unable to close the achievement gap, which is, at the end of the day, what this is supposed to be about for schools, right? In terms of the paper, I liked the chart, the really complicated chart and mathematical equation your eyes glazed over on over how the tax cap's actually calculated. This has been billed as a 2% tax cap. It is not a 2% tax cap. It's actually a 0% tax cap because a school district without voter approval of a proposed budget cannot increase their levy by $1. If a budget is defeated by the voters and the district offers a second budget irrespective of what it is and it's defeated, your levy is frozen to the prior year. That's a 0% tax cap because you need permission from voters to raise $1. Deborah also spoke about this, that we have seen average revenue go up, between 2% and 3% for schools, but costs have been increasing between 4% and 6% on average in recent years, largely due to things outside of the district's control. Pension costs have increased rapidly in recent years. Healthcare costs continue to increase, and part of that's collectively bargained, but in the short run, you can't alter those costs. The other thing that's going on now is a rapid growth in enrollment, particularly in some downstate suburban and urban areas, of unaccompanied minors, as well as just general demographic shifts. The tax cap does nothing to account for that. So if you have a school district, I'll use an extreme example to make a point, that tomorrow doubled their enrollment, they can't adjust their tax levy to account for those new children they are required by law to educate. It's kind of nonsensical, right? Yet this is what we have to deal with. The one other thing I just want to mention is mandate relief that flag has been waved a couple of times, and I twitch slightly when it's waved, because that is a false promise. There is no mandate relief that can make up for the gap in funding that's gone on because of the compression of the tax cap on local revenues, plus the lack of state aid. You have 51% of school districts getting less dollars before adjusting for inflation than they got 6 years ago. There's no mandate relief. The only mandate relief that would close that would be cutting salaries and benefits drastically. No one's proposing that. No one's suggesting that. The other thing I'll just poke at a bit is people often talk about how we're very high on tax per capita for schools and municipalities generally. That data generally does not adjust for cost of living, nor does it adjust for average incomes. If you look at the list of states that have very high taxes per capita, those states also are the ones typically, unless like in Alaska, which is an outlier, that have very high, amongst the highest, incomes per capita. So when you compare New York and New Hampshire and Maryland and New Jersey to Wyoming and Minnesota and South Dakota, no kidding, our taxes are higher. Our incomes are way higher. Cost of living is way higher. That's a false comparison you get lots of times, suggesting not that our tax burden isn't high, but it is relatively high. But you look down that list of states with high taxes per capita, they're all high-cost Northeast states that also have high incomes. So it's not exactly an entirely fair comparison to use that. So I wanted to point that out, like I mentioned earlier today. I probably used my 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to invite those of you from the audience who have questions or comments to please come up. What our panel has been more heavily weighted towards school perspectives because we knew that the student presentation would be heavily weighted toward the local government perspective. And we've raised issues of demography, which Mac Cook raised this morning, the issue of equity, the issue of the need for a new kind of state-local partnership, and maintaining quality of services. So let's go to the questions.
Just a quick question and one comment. I know that our supermajority is very different than Massachusetts, and we're comparing apples and oranges when we do that. And we have only a couple years of data, but do we see the same override for affluent school districts as frequently as Massachusetts has seen it with 2 years of data right now?
Yes, we are seeing it also for local communities, for wealthier communities. You got to remember they have greater reliance on the property tax.
So it
So it goes
it furthers
across,
the inequity
yes.
for our students then?
I'd actually suggest you haven't seen enough overrides to get a good handle on that.
Understood.
On the municipal
That's fair.
side, you've had somewhere between 25 and 35% of towns, villages, counties overriding the cap. It's relatively easy for relative to going to voters, right? It's easier. In some places, you have a 3 or a 5 member town or village board. Your majority, your simple majority, is your supermajority. 2 of 3 or 3 of 5 covers both. So in school districts, you've had less than 10% of districts per year attempt an override. This past year, it was less than 6% of districts attempted the override. So it's probably too early to say.
Yeah, I think that Peter mentioned the default provision, that if you try an override, really twice, if you try it twice and you fail, you don't lapse to the limit, you lapse to 0%. And so school districts, I think, are very reluctant to even try overrides. And there's not been a good success rate. So I think there's we're going to have a more problematical record than Massachusetts.
We've had
Yeah.
those,
On top
we've
of
had
which
those
with-
discussions in Schenectady schools before, so yeah, I
Yeah,
agree
so
with you.
in Massachusetts, if you look in the comparison across the state tax caps, the student's second issue brief, they talk about Colorado, where out of, 330 attempted overrides, 323 were successful. In Massachusetts, overrides are more successful in richer communities. And so the kind of divergence that you were describing, Peter, even gets greater because poor communities are less likely to have successful overrides. And so the difference between the educational expenditure just keeps getting wider. That's what we can know from the other states.
And remember that assuming that this tax-free credit that Frank mentioned stays in place, you're going to see even fewer attempted overrides. As long as the voter's going to understand what's going on there. I'm not so sure people understand when they got a check for $50 or a couple $100 within the last 6 weeks. Like a lot of voters got a check and thought, I don't know what this is for. That's not the worst thing. We can usually get rid of, right? But you only had 24 districts out of almost 700 statewide attempt an override this year, down from almost 50 the first year of the tax cap. 17 of those 24 were successful, and the residents therefore didn't qualify for those rebate checks. Going forward, you're probably not going to see very many. The other thing that happens because of the 0% fallback provision is that the vast majority of school districts are not proposing tax increases anywhere close to their levy limit. So if your levy limit for an individual district, let's say, is 2.75%, districts there are proposing 2.1. But if it's a 2.1 levy limit, they're proposing 1.5. That's something no one anticipated when this happened. People assumed they would go up to their levy limit, within reason, so they didn't need the supermajority, but they'd access all the available funds they could, especially because these levy limits in most places are small. It's not like it's 7, 8, 9%. It's 0, 1, 2, 3%, and districts are not using all of that. So that's had a compounding problem as well.
Just one other quick comment. As far as retired Americans and retired state citizens that say, well, I'm on a fixed income, I can't afford any tax increase, I think we need to, because I'm on the executive committee for the Capital District New York State Alliance for Retired Americans, I think we need to educate them and allow them to see some of this data and form their opinions based on what we're seeing here. So I think as a group in this room, we could do a better job of that.
We're all about data in this conference. Thank you very much. The next question?
Dave Little from the Rural Schools Association. My friends at NICET are about to see how liberating a change in employment status can be. I just want to follow
at the mic.
I just want to follow up on Peter's comment about the effectiveness of mandate relief, because virtually every presentation this morning included mandate relief and the lack of mandate relief to date as having been a limitation in what we've done. But I also heard that spending is flat when adjusted for inflation, taxes are flat when adjusted for inflation, and the decline in salaries and benefits in the manufacturing sector has been deemed to be deleterious. And so I'm wondering if mandate relief is even in the public sector is even advisable, let alone be effective.
Well, I'd say it's a false construct the governor laid out there. He said, I'm gonna cap your levies. Wait, I'm not giving you any state aid to make up for it. We know the feds aren't gonna help. So I got this thing called mandate relief. It's a black box. You'll love it. When you open it later, you'll love it. But you open it, there's nothing in there. You know, some special, a lot of it's administrative relief, which is fine, but it doesn't save billions of dollars statewide. You save billions and billions of dollars statewide. That's salary and benefits. I work for a union, we're not into that. But even the governor doesn't suggest we should have some massive reduction in salary and benefits. That's the only way you could substantially alter the existing structure of costs. That's not on the table. So the mandate relief is a false promise. Leads people down a road, and you get there. Even his own commission, at the end they released a report, commissioners didn't know it was even being released. There was nothing there. It's a false premise that just mandates you can get rid of that will somehow release billions of dollars in schools and municipalities that will allow you to function under a cap structured like this. I'd love to see the list of those mandates.
Could you do away with math?
Marion wants to.
Math and English you can get rid of, that would work.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that I went to a mandate relief meeting. Barbara was the MC of this meeting in Rye, New York, school district. This is a school district I'm fairly familiar with. In fact, I wrote a book chapter comparing Rye to its neighbor, Portchester, quite different demographics, et cetera. So Rye, New York was very concerned about mandate relief, et cetera, but they wanted to be tax cap compliant for all the obvious reasons. So fast forward a year and a half, Rye, New York has greatly increased the funding to its nonprofit foundation. That's not news. We've been testifying about the fact that this would be a way to avoid the cap for a long time. But in addition, Rye has implemented a utility tax. Now, you cannot deduct payments to a utility, but Rye, New York is sufficiently determined that it will not change the quality or quantity of educational provision to its students. It would rather have a utility tax, and that's not part of the cap. So this is coming because others who are able to do so will do so. So that's how they've dealt with mandate relief.
And I'd just like to clarify, when I was using the term mandate relief, it was in the context of local government, and I'm particularly thinking about county mandated services that the state actually provides in other states, and New York decentralizes that fiscal responsibility onto a county, so it is a mandate, and in that sense, mandate relief would mean re-centralizing those expenditures back to the state level. And that's where that 64 cents on every dollar is paid for at the local level, and a lot of those dollars are actually state welfare dollars that should be paid for by the state level and are paid for by the state in other states, and that's part of what makes our local tax burden high. So I shouldn't have used the word mandate relief. I probably should have used the word re-centralizing fiscal expenditure responsibility.
I just get twitchy, that's all.
Yeah, but let's take another comment.
Yeah, Joya Shebar, Tax Nightmare. I'm from the other position, which is pro bono, working for taxpayers who are disgusted with the tax. That movement could have gone south and gotten even uglier than it is, the taxpayer protest movement, except for Frank Mauro and Ron Deutsch, with whom we work and who have helped us to conceptualize this thing so it isn't, we have this rotten school tax, we've got teachers with unions, we've got teachers making a whole bunch of money. This is not a progressive movement when you're dealing with the civilians. And they have helped us immeasurably to change the dialogue because it's there and it's very ugly. And to the information that you're giving is very important for us. Doesn't help civilians. See, they get the tax bill and they don't understand that it's higher because New York has higher per capita income. It means nothing to them as individuals. So we need that information, those of us who are leading the taxpayer movement. But with Frank and Ron, who are gold, by the way, I mean, there is nobody, including E.J. McMahon, who doesn't quote Frank. So if I want to get something across, where did you get that? Frank Mauro said it. Okay, I don't hate unions anymore. You know, it's that kind of thing. It's that simple. What we need, now we tried to get the circuit breaker. It was a little too complicated. What Frank is talking about now, which is basically the wealth gap, rich getting most of what's coming, what is being produced in New York State, and you're getting screwed, fella, it's showing up on your property tax, is to try and shift that hatred of the teacher and the whatever, government, where it belongs. And I think that's what we're going to be doing. Isn't it, Frank, from now on?
Well, we'll try.
And that's going to be very important. I want you to keep that in mind, everybody. The simpler we make it, because that has always been an issue. When we go to Albany, what we're told is, we don't have the money. Sure you have the money. You're giving $12 billion a year back to Wall Street on the stock transfer tax. No other major stock trading situation, Geneva, Hong Kong, any of them. Nobody does that, only New York. You know what we could do with $12 billion? I mean, that's the focus that we're going to take, and I hope you're going to help us with that. Anyway, that's where we are right now, is the taxpayer protest movement.
Thank you very much, Joyce. And it's very important not only to think about data, but to think about messaging. And I appreciate Joyce making the call for clear messaging, keeping it simple, but keeping it honest. And that's part of what we'll be doing in the afternoon sessions. But I'm going to take one more comment from the floor before we close the panel.
Thank you. Jackie Paredes, New York State United Teachers. Just one comment. The reason why there's confusion as to does it expire, the tax cap, 2015 or 2016, and Peter, you can help me out with this if I'm explaining it correctly. School budget votes are held in May for the following year. So technically, the tax cap expires in June. So, or because it's tied to rent control. That is in June when that is supposed to expire. Technically, voters already held and voted on their budgets in May. So that's why the amendments to the tax cap must be made in 2015 as opposed to 2016. That's all. Thank you.
The strange political bedfellows of how policy gets made. So with that, I would like to thank you all. Rod has now come up to talk to us about the break in the next sessions.
So I'm here just to tell you where the different rooms are. So if you're going to economic development, you leave the room, turn to the left, and go around the bend, go through the lounge, and the room is actually to the outside of the lounge. So go to the lounge, find the lounge. For innovations and service delivery, when you leave here, you're going to turn to the right, to the Hathrone room. If you're going to infrastructure needs, you're going to go all the way past the lobby, and the red room is past the lobby. Potential for citizen union municipal cooperation, when you leave here, turn to the right, and the COSA room is just over here. And designing social indicators is also in a room past the lobby in the blue room. I didn't ask Jim and Pete if they're okay for hosting, moderating. Okay, great. So the host and moderators keep things on time, make sure they have a little bit of a break. We're all going to be back here at 4 o'clock. So go off and enjoy more intimate conversations now.